Are you prepared to find out what waits beyond reality? It's time to plunge into the abyss from which there is no return. In the silence broken only by your own heartbeat, darkness and horrors capable of shocking even the bravest lie in wait. Are you ready to face what hides in the shadows? What dark force pierces the silence? And what happens when every rustle becomes a cry of despair? Can you withstand the intense fear that becomes palpable and overwhelming? What if something around the corner can shatter your reality? In this world, every step brings you closer to the unknown horror, and every breath is a harbinger of unimaginable evil. Hold on tight and don't look away. The darkness will consume you.
In the heart of an abandoned village, lost amidst dense forests, stood an old house, ravaged by time. Its walls, covered in mold and cobwebs, held many dark secrets. No local dared to approach the place, which had a chilling reputation. It was said that within the house was a room that did not belong to this world, and anyone who entered it vanished without a trace. Mary, a young journalist, arrived in the village seeking sensational stories for her blog. She had heard many tales about this mysterious house and decided to investigate them personally. The locals tried to convince her to stay away, but Mary was not one to be intimidated by rumors. As she approached the house, a cold wind pierced through her, and the doors creaked as if inviting her inside. As she crossed the threshold, the first terrifying thought flashed through her mind. What if I can't get out? Even on the doorstep, she felt something invisible wrapping its cold fingers around her, but she resolutely stepped inside. But was it her own will? The house looked eerie. The walls were covered in cracks from which dark, sticky liquid oozed. The remaining furniture was broken and twisted, as though some otherworldly forces had unleashed their fury upon it. What could have caused such destruction? Every step Mary took echoed through the empty rooms, reverberating with a sinister hum. But what attracted her most was the room on the second floor. What drew her there? She climbed the creaky staircase, which seemed on the verge of collapsing under her weight. When she reached the end of the hallway, she faced heavy, rust-covered doors. The lock on them was old and looked as if it hadn't been opened for centuries. But as soon as Mary touched it, the doors effortlessly swung open. The interior of the room looked entirely different. The air was thick and musty, and the light from the windows emitted a strange, greenish glow. Tables and chairs were scattered as if from some battle, and portraits on the walls had eyes that seemed to follow Mary's every move. On the floor lay old, yellowed papers that she carefully picked up. They were covered with incomprehensible symbols and drawings of strange creatures. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on her neck. Turning around, she saw her reflection in a mirror hanging on the wall. But her eyes in that reflection were black, bottomless like night. She tried to look away, but the mirror seemed to pull her in like a vortex. Suddenly, the room filled with whispers. They came from every corner, turning into a dull roar that made her blood run cold. Mary felt the floor beneath her starting to move, drawing her into an abyss. She tried to escape, but the walls of the room suddenly began to close in, trapping her. Her hands pressed against the cold, slippery walls that began to tremble as if alive. Overwhelmed by terror, Mary began to scream, but her voice was quickly drowned out by the eerie sounds coming from the darkness. She saw shadows beginning to leak from the walls, forming figures with ghostly faces and empty eye sockets. They approached her, reaching out with hands covered in decaying flesh and exposed bones. As the shadows touched her, Mary felt her body begin to disintegrate into tiny pieces, as if the darkness itself was consuming her. In the final moments of her existence, she realized that she had entered another dimension where there was neither time nor place for salvation. The next day, the doors were locked again. No one saw Mary anymore. The village returned to its routine, but the eerie legend of the otherworldly room remained. The house continued to stand, waiting for its next victim. Then there was a knock at the door. Startled, Mary turned around and suddenly realized that she was standing in front of her own house. Everything was as she had left it, only now her house seemed old and abandoned. With horror in her eyes, she realized that the room had already found its new occupant. While Mary was grappling with the horrific manifestations of the house, her friends began to worry about her absence. They decided to come to the village and find her. Among them were Jack, her old university friend, and Sarah, a photographer who had always supported Mary in her adventures. They set out in search, armed with flashlights and recorders. As they approached the house, a sense of fear washed over their skin. Jack and Sarah felt the cold piercing their bones. They entered and immediately felt that something was not right. Does the house sense their presence? They cautiously climbed the same stairs Mary had taken. Each step echoed through the empty rooms, resonating with a sinister hum. When they reached the room, the doors were already open. Jack and Sarah exchanged worried glances before entering. The room looked the same as when Mary saw it. They saw a mirror reflecting something other than themselves. Their faces in the mirror were distorted and eerie. Jack began to hear whispers coming from every corner of the room. They sounded like scattered voices overlapping each other, but all of them spoke of the same thing.
She is yours. Take her.
Sarah noticed something on the floor. It was the same yellowed newspaper Mary had found. It spoke of disappearances of people in this house over the last 50 years. All had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and their bodies were never found. Sarah felt fear grip her from within. Meanwhile, Jack began to experience strange phenomena. He saw the walls of the room starting to close around him. They were compressing like a vice, leaving him no chance to escape. He tried to run out of the room, but the doors suddenly disappeared, leaving him trapped in darkness. Sarah tried to find Jack, but the house began to play with her mind. She heard a child's laughter coming from the corners of the room. She saw a little girl standing in the shadows with black, bottomless eyes and a sinister smile. The girl approached her and whispered,
Play with me, or I'll take your soul.
Jack, struggling against the darkness and fear, finally found a way out of the room. But when he returned to Sarah, she was already gone. Now he was alone in this nightmare, surrounded by strange shadows and whispers. As Jack searched for Sarah, the house began to reveal its true forms. Rooms started to change shape. Corridors disappeared, leaving him trapped. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself in a mirrored room surrounded by her distorted reflections. She saw her face beginning to change, resembling the faces of those who had disappeared in this house. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost. She realized that now she was part of this house, lost in time and space. Jack finally found a way out, but the door was locked with a massive, ancient lock. He heard a whisper,
Open the door, and you will find the truth.
but there was no key. Jack realized that the key was with Sarah. When he finally found her, Sarah was no longer who she once was. Her eyes were black, bottomless like night. She handed him the key and said,
You must leave while you can.
Jack realized that her soul was already lost, and he had to leave alone. He escaped from the room, but when he looked back, he saw the house starting to collapse behind him. Sarah disappeared into the shadows, and no one saw her again. Jack ran outside, and the door closed behind him. He survived, but was forever marked by the horrors he had witnessed. A few days later, Jack began to notice oddities in his daily life. His reflection in the mirror no longer followed his movements. He started hearing strange rustling sounds in his apartment at night, as if someone was slowly creeping up on him in the dark. One night he heard a familiar voice. It was Sarah's voice. She called him by name, her voice full of terror. Jack rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open no matter how hard he tried. Suddenly, a scraping sound made his blood run cold. He turned around and saw a shadow moving on the wall, growing larger and larger. Just as he was about to scream, everything went dark. He felt a cold hand touch his shoulder. He turned around and saw an empty, ghostly face staring at him. The last thing he heard was Sarah's whisper.
You are now a part of the house, just like us.
The house claimed another victim. The old house stood silent, awaiting its next guest. The legend of the otherworldly room continued to spread, and new stories of terror began to circulate in the village. No one knew who would be next, but one thing was certain. The house would continue to wait for those daring enough to enter.